My sister Cassandra clinked her champagne glass at her lavish wedding reception, her voice dripping with condescension as she announced to 300 guests that I was too broke to even afford a decent dress for her special day. As the crowd turned to stare at me in my simple navy sundress and my niece Emma's face flushed with embarrassment, Cassandra outlined how she'd always been the successful one while I'd wasted my potential on charity work and living like a pauper. What she didn't know was that the slim leather portfolio I quietly retrieved from my purse contained documents about the $84 million trust fund I'd been managing since our grandmother's death 3 years ago, a fund Cassandra knew nothing about. The look on her face when I placed those papers on the head table right next to her $15,000 wedding cake was absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Grand Belmore Hotel in Asherton had always been Cassandra's dream venue. The palatial ballroom with its soaring crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor had hosted countless society weddings, and my sister had spent the last 18 months planning every microscopic detail of her union to Preston Whitmore III, heir to a regional banking fortune. Everything had to be perfect, everything had to scream wealth and status, and most importantly, everything had to prove that Cassandra Fitzgerald had finally achieved the life she'd always believed she deserved. I had arrived early, wanting to help with any last-minute preparations, despite Cassandra's repeated insistence that she had professionals handling everything. My navy sundress was new, purchased specifically for this occasion from a boutique downtown, modest but elegant. I thought it appropriate for a late-afternoon garden wedding. My daughter Riley, 16, wore a soft yellow dress that complemented her auburn hair, while my son Owen, 13, had been persuaded into a blazer and tie with only minimal complaints. As guests began arriving, I noticed the meticulous social choreography Cassandra had orchestrated. The seating chart placed Preston's family and their business associates at premium tables near the head table, while our extended family was scattered throughout the room based on what I could only assume was Cassandra's assessment of their social value. My small family had been assigned to table 17, tucked in the back corner near the service entrance, partially obscured by an elaborate floral arrangement. "Mom, why are we sitting back here?" Riley whispered as we found our seats. "Aunt Cassandra's your only sister." I squeezed her hand gently. "Your aunt has her reasons, I'm sure." Those reasons had been developing over the course of our entire lives. Cassandra, older by 4 years, had always been the ambitious one, the one who chased prestigious internships and Ivy League credentials, who carefully curated her social circle based on potential networking value. I had taken a different path, one that had increasingly disappointed and then frustrated my sister. After completing my degree in social work, I'd spent the last 15 years working for various nonprofit organizations, most recently as program director for Riverside Community Services, helping families navigate poverty and housing insecurity. My modest salary of $52,000 a year barely covered our needs. I rented a small 3-bedroom house in Meadowbrook, a working-class neighborhood where kids played street hockey and neighbors actually knew each other's names. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper. My children attended public school. By Cassandra's standards, I had squandered every advantage our upper-middle-class upbringing had provided. What Cassandra didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that 3 years ago, our grandmother, Josephine, had passed away and left her considerable estate in a trust. Grandmother Jo had been a remarkably astute investor, quietly building wealth over decades through careful stock selections and real estate investments. The trust was valued at $84 million, with specific instructions that it be used to support meaningful work that serves others rather than merely accumulating more wealth. Grandmother Jo had appointed me as the sole trustee with complete discretion over its management and use. The instructions were private, delivered through her attorney with explicit direction that Cassandra not be informed. "Your sister has her own path," Grandmother Jo's letter had explained. "She values different things than you do, and that's for choice. But this resource should support the work you're doing, the life you've chosen.
Use it wisely, use it quietly, and don't let anyone pressure you into believing that wealth must be displayed to have value. For 3 years, I'd honored that request. I'd continued living simply, working my nonprofit job, raising my children in our modest rental house. The trust had been invested conservatively, growing steadily while I'd use small portions to anonymously fund various community initiatives. A scholarship program at Riley and Owen School, renovation of the Riverside Community Center, expansion of the food pantry program I administered. I took no salary from the trust, wanting to ensure that my children understood the value of work and purpose beyond financial comfort. The ceremony itself was beautiful, I had to admit. Cassandra looked stunning in her custom Vera Wang gown. Preston was appropriately besotted, and the string quartet played flawlessly as they exchanged vows in the hotel's manicured gardens. I felt genuine happiness for my sister, hoping that this new chapter might bring her the fulfillment she'd been chasing.
The reception began with the usual progression: grand entrance, first dance, toasts from the best man and maid of honor. The meal was exquisite, each course more elaborate than the last. Around me, Preston's business associates discussed market trends and vacation properties, their conversations a familiar symphony of casual wealth. Then came the moment that changed everything. Cassandra stood, microphone in hand, her face flushed from champagne and attention. "I want to take a moment," she announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "to talk about family." I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of attention. "My sister, Penelope, is here tonight," Cassandra continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "Way back there at table 17. Stand up, Penny. Let people see you." Reluctantly, I rose, feeling 300 pairs of eyes turn toward our corner. "Penny and I took very different paths in life," Cassandra said, her tone shifting into something I recognized with sinking dread. "I pursued success, built a career, married well. Penny chose charity work." She said it the way someone might say garbage collection. "She lives in a rental house in Meadowbrook, drives a car that probably shouldn't pass inspection, and couldn't even afford a proper dress for my wedding." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Riley's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tight. Owen stared at his plate, his jaw clenched. "But that's okay," Cassandra continued with false magnanimity. "Not everyone can be successful. Some people are just meant to help others, I suppose, even if it means being too broke to—" "Cassandra," my voice cut through her monologue, calm but carrying. "That's enough." She blinked, surprised by the interruption. "I'm just being honest, Penny. There's no shame in—" "I said that's enough." I reached into my purse, extracting the slim leather portfolio I'd brought with me. Insurance, I'd told myself when packing it, just in case. The case had arrived. The Grand Belmore Hotel had been a fixture in Asherton society for over a century, its Georgian architecture and impeccable service making it the preferred venue for families who measured their worth in generations rather than decades. As a child, I had attended exactly one event here, our cousin Bethany's debutante ball, and I remembered feeling overwhelmed by the opulence, the careful stratification of guests, the unspoken rules about which families belonged at which tables. Cassandra, even at 14, had belonged here in a way I never would. She'd glided through that evening with natural confidence, already networking with the sons and daughters of Asherton's established families, already understanding the social choreography that I found exhausting and artificial. Our childhood in the suburb of Willowcrest was comfortable, but not extravagant. Our father, Daniel, had been a successful architect with his own firm, while our mother, Christine, taught literature at the local college. They'd valued education, encouraged curiosity, and emphasized the importance of contributing meaningfully to the world. But they'd also been practical people who drove sensible cars, took modest vacations, and believed that true security came from skills and character rather than inherited wealth. Grandmother Josephine had been different. She'd lived alone in a gracious but unpretentious Victorian house on Maple Street, walking distance from the university where our mother taught. While our parents worked, Cassandra and I often spent afternoons there, supposedly doing homework, but more often listening to Grandmother Joe's stories about her own unconventional life. She'd been widowed young, left with a small inheritance and an infant daughter to raise. Rather than remarry for security, as was expected in her generation, she'd taught herself about investments, started buying rental properties in neighborhoods others dismissed as unpromising, and quietly built substantial wealth through patience and contrarian thinking. The secret, she once told me while we worked in her garden, is understanding the difference between value and price. Most people only see the latter. Cassandra had little patience for Grandmother Joe's philosophy. She'd visit dutifully, but always seemed restless, eager to return to activities that would advance her social position. The right clubs, the right volunteer work, the right circles. I, on the other hand, had treasured those afternoons, helping Grandmother Joe tend her roses while she explained her investment strategies or discussed the books she was reading. "You have your mother's heart," Grandmother Joe told me once during my senior year of college, when I'd announced my intention to study social work instead of pursuing the business degree Cassandra insisted was more practical. "You see people, not just economic units. Don't let anyone convince you that's a weakness." Cassandra was appalled by my choice. By then, she was already working at a prestigious consulting firm in downtown Asherton, living in a stylish apartment in the Harbor District, dating men who wore custom suits and discussed mergers over expensive whiskey. My decision to work with low-income families, to live modestly so I could better understand the challenges my clients faced, struck her as a willful waste of potential. "You could have done anything," she'd said during one particularly heated conversation at a family dinner, "and you chose to be poor on purpose." "I'm not poor," I replied evenly. "I have meaningful work, a home, everything I need." "You rent a house in Meadowbrook," she'd countered, as if the neighborhood name itself proved her point. "You could have bought a condo downtown years ago if you'd made different choices." What Cassandra never understood was that my choices were deliberate, not default. After graduating, I'd married Thomas Chen, a teacher I'd met through mutual friends. We'd had 8 good years together before his death in a car accident when Riley was 6 and Owen was 3. The insurance settlement had been enough to provide some stability, but single parenthood on a nonprofit salary meant careful budgeting and constant financial juggling. I'd considered moving to a cheaper city, finding higher-paying work, but Asherton was home. My parents were here, Grandmother Joe was here, and most importantly, Thomas's parents were here, Riley and Owen's grandparents, who provided invaluable support and connection to their father's memory. Grandmother Joe had helped quietly during those difficult years, paying for summer camps the children loved, covering unexpected medical bills, ensuring that financial stress didn't compound grief. But she'd never made me feel dependent or inadequate. Instead, she'd treated these contributions as natural expressions of family care, no different than the casseroles our mother brought over or the babysitting Thomas's parents provided. When Grandmother Joe died 3 years ago at 92, the family gathered at her Victorian house for the reading of the will. I expected modest inheritances, perhaps small amounts for each grandchild's education. Instead, her attorney, Mr. Harrison, had requested a private meeting with me alone after the general reading. "Your grandmother left the bulk of her estate in trust," he'd explained, sliding documents across his desk. "The value is approximately $84 million, comprised of diversified investments, real estate holdings, and liquid assets. She's appointed you as sole trustee, with complete discretionary authority over its management and distribution." The number had been incomprehensible. Grandmother Joe had lived so simply. The same house for 50 years, a modest car, practical clothes. The documents Mr. Harrison showed me revealed the scope of her quiet success. Residential properties in neighborhoods that had appreciated dramatically,
early investments in technology companies that had grown exponentially, a disciplined strategy of reinvestment that had compounded over decades. Why me? I'd asked, still processing the revelation. Mr. Harrison handed me a sealed letter in Grandmother Joe's distinctive handwriting. She wanted you to read this privately, but I can tell you that she was very clear about her reasoning and her wishes. The letter, which I still kept in a locked box at home, explained everything. Grandmother Joe had watched both her granddaughters carefully over the years. She'd seen Cassandra's drive, her ambition, her focus on external markers of success. Your sister will do well for herself, the letter read. She has the personality and skills to succeed in conventional terms, and she'll find validation in that success. She doesn't need this trust. In fact, I fear it might harm her development to receive it now. But you, my dear Penelope, have chosen a different path. You've chosen work that matters but pays modestly. You've chosen integrity over image. You've chosen to live simply so you can serve meaningfully. This trust is meant to support that choice, to ensure that financial constraint never forces you to abandon work you find purposeful. The letter had continued with specific instructions. Manage the trust conservatively, use portions of it to support community initiatives that aligned with my values, but most importantly, continue living authentically. Don't let this wealth change your fundamental approach to life, Grandmother Joe had written. The money is a tool, not an identity. Use it wisely, use it quietly, and never let anyone, especially your sister, make you feel ashamed of the life you've chosen. The instruction not to tell Cassandra had been explicit and, frankly, a relief. I'd known how my sister would react, first with shock, then with resentment that Grandmother Joe had entrusted me rather than her with such substantial assets, finally with judgment about how I was wasting the opportunity by not using it to elevate my lifestyle. So I'd kept the secret for 3 years. I'd continued my work at Riverside Community Services, continued living in our rental house, continued driving my dented Honda. The trust had grown to its current value through conservative management and careful reinvestment. I'd used small portions, never more than 2% annually, to fund community initiatives that made genuine differences. Scholarships for first-generation college students, renovations to the underfunded community center, expansion of after-school programs in underserved neighborhoods. My children knew nothing about the trust. I wanted them to develop their own relationship with work, purpose, and money before introducing that complexity. Riley was already showing interest in environmental science, volunteering with a local conservation group. Owen had discovered a talent for coding and spent hours building programs to solve problems he identified in daily life. They were learning the same lessons Grandmother Joe valued. That contribution mattered more than accumulation. That purpose provided deeper satisfaction than possession. Now, standing at table 17 in the Grand Belmore Ballroom with my sister's cruel words still hanging in the air and 300 guests staring at me with varying expressions of pity and discomfort, I realized that my carefully maintained privacy was about to end. The leather portfolio in my hands felt heavier than its physical weight suggested. Inside were recent trust statements, documentation of assets, proof of everything Cassandra assumed didn't exist. I hadn't brought these documents planning to use them. I'd brought them as a reminder to myself that my sister's judgment didn't define my worth, that external appearances didn't reflect internal reality, that I had nothing to prove. But Cassandra had crossed a line. She'd humiliated me publicly, used her wedding as a platform to reinforce her narrative about success and failure, and worst of all, she'd done it in front of my children, in front of Riley and Owen, who were now watching to see how their mother responded to this public diminishment.
Sometimes I realized the most loving thing you can do is establish a boundary, even when it's uncomfortable. I began walking toward the head table, the portfolio held firmly in my hand. The ballroom's ambient noise, clinking glasses, murmured conversations, the soft background music, seemed to fade as I made my way through the maze of tables toward the front of the room. Each step felt deliberate, measured. I was aware of heads turning, of whispered comments rippling through the crowd like concentric circles on water. Preston's mother, Vivian Whitmore, sat at the head table with the expression of someone who just witnessed a social faux pas at a diplomatic dinner. Preston himself looked uncomfortable, his hand reaching for Cassandra's arm as if to suggest she'd gone far enough. But my sister's face held that familiar mixture of self-righteousness and triumph, the look she'd worn countless times when she believed she'd proven a point about my life choices. Riley and Owen remained at our table, both frozen in their seats. My daughter's face was flushed, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Owen's hands were clenched into fists on the tablecloth, his jaw tight with the particular rage that comes from watching someone you love being publicly humiliated. As I approached the head table, I caught fragments of whispered conversations around me. Always thought Cassandra was harsh, but this is her own sister at her wedding of all places. Who humiliates family like that? Cassandra finally noticed my approach, her self-satisfied expression flickering slightly as she registered that I wasn't simply accepting her pronouncement and returning to my assigned corner. She lowered the microphone, but didn't release it, as if maintaining control over the narrative required maintaining control over the amplification. "Penny, there's no need to make a scene," she said, her voice carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. "I wasn't trying to embarrass you. I was just being honest about our different circumstances." Were you being honest, or were you performing for an audience? I placed the leather portfolio on the table between us, right next to the elaborate place cards calligraphied with gold ink, the Hermes favor boxes tied with silk ribbon, all the carefully curated details that screamed expensive taste. "What's that?" Cassandra asked, eyeing the portfolio with suspicion. "Documentation," I replied simply. "Since you've decided to make my financial situation a topic of public discussion at your wedding reception, I thought it might be appropriate to provide some clarity." Preston leaned forward, his expression shifting from discomfort to concern. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately," I said, keeping my tone even. "Your wife chose to make it public. I'm simply responding in kind." Cassandra's hand moved protectively toward the portfolio, as if she might sweep it away before its contents could be revealed, but something in my expression stopped her. For the first time since her microphone announcement, uncertainty crossed her face. "For years, you've operated under certain assumptions about my life. You've assumed that because I work in the nonprofit sector, because I live in Meadowbrook, because I drive a car with a dented bumper, that I'm struggling, that I've failed, that I've wasted opportunities you would have seized." "You live in a rental house," Cassandra interjected, her voice defensive now. "You shop at discount stores. Your children go to public school. Those are facts, not assumptions." "They're choices," I corrected, "which you've consistently interpreted as limitations rather than as deliberate decisions reflecting values you don't share." Vivian Whitmore was watching this exchange with the alert interest of someone who'd spent decades navigating society politics. Several of Preston's groomsmen had turned fully in their seats, no longer pretending to have private conversations. The photographer, unsure whether to document this moment or remain invisible, had lowered his camera. "You work for a nonprofit that can barely keep its lights on. You make what, $50,000 a year? You've never taken a real vacation. You couldn't even afford a decent dress for my wedding." "This dress cost $400, which I thought was excessive, but I wanted to honor your occasion. It's from Adeline's boutique downtown. You know, the one you mentioned in your last Instagram post as having surprisingly elevated pieces for a local shop." Cassandra blinked, thrown by the specific detail. "But you're right about my salary. I make $52,000 a year working for Riverside Community Services. That's accurate. What you don't know, what you've never bothered to ask about, is why I've continued in that role despite having other options." "What other options?" Cassandra asked, and I heard genuine bewilderment in her voice. In her framework, options meant higher-paying corporate positions, not anything else. "The option," I said quietly, opening the portfolio, "that came with grandmother Joe's trust.
The name hung in the air between us. Our grandmother, who died 3 years ago, whose funeral Cassandra had attended but left immediately after the service claiming urgent work obligations that couldn't be rescheduled. She had been present for the general will reading, where modest bequests had been distributed to various family members, $10,000 to each grandchild, some jewelry and personal items the Victorian house left to our mother. "Grandmother Joe left you something?" Cassandra asked, her tone suggesting this was unlikely given my perceived status as the disappointing grandchild. "Grandmother Joe left me something," I confirmed. "Something she was very specific about, with very specific instructions."
I extracted the first document, a summary statement from the trust account, dated from last month. The letterhead was from Harrison, Patterson and Associates, the prestigious law firm that had handled Grandmother Joe's affairs for decades. I placed it where Cassandra could see it clearly. Her eyes scanned the page, stopping at the relevant line. I watched the information register, the confusion, the disbelief, the rapid recalculation happening behind her eyes. "That can't be right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Current value, $84.7 million, I read from the document. "The trust has performed well over the past 3 years. Grandmother Joe was a remarkably astute investor." Preston's eyes had gone wide. Vivian Whitmore leaned forward, her expression transforming from polite concern to sharp interest. Several guests at nearby tables had given up any pretense of not listening. "84 million, Cassandra repeated, as if saying the number might make it comprehensible. Grandmother Joe had $84 million? She built it over 60 years, I explained. Real estate investments in neighborhoods others overlooked, early positions in technology companies before they became household names. A disciplined strategy of reinvestment and long-term thinking. She lived simply, spent modestly, and let compound interest work its magic. And she left it to you?" The question emerged with a complex mixture of emotions, disbelief, confusion, and underneath it all the first stirrings of something that looked like anger. Why would she leave it to you instead of dividing it between us? This was the question I'd known would come, the one I'd spent 3 years considering how to answer if this moment ever arrived. "Because she knew you didn't need it," I said simply. "You've built your own success through your career, your networking, your strategic choices. You're exactly where you want to be, achieving exactly what you've always valued. Grandmother Joe recognized that and respected it." "But $84 million, Cassandra said, and her voice cracked slightly. "That's not just money for someone who needs it. That's generational wealth. That's a tool," I interrupted gently, which is exactly how Grandmother Joe viewed it, not as an identity or a trophy, but as a resource to support meaningful work. She left it to me with specific instructions about how it should be used. I extracted another document, a letter from Mr. Harrison outlining the trust's purpose and my discretionary authority over its management and distribution. Cassandra reached for it, but I held it back. The instructions were private, between Grandmother Joe, her attorney, and me, but I can tell you that she wanted the trust to support work that serves others, to be used quietly and strategically, and specifically, I paused, knowing this next part would sting, she requested that you not be informed about its existence. The ballroom had gone almost completely silent now. The band had stopped playing between songs and hadn't resumed. Waiters stood frozen with trays half raised. Even the bartenders had paused mid-pour. She didn't want me to know? Cassandra's voice was small now, stripped of her earlier confidence. Why would she do that? Because she knew how you'd react, I said. And there was no cruelty in my tone, just honesty. She knew you'd judge how I was using it. She knew you'd have opinions about what I should do differently. She knew that your values and mine were fundamentally different, and she didn't want those differences to create conflict. Preston's hand had found Cassandra's, squeezing it gently. For the first time, my sister looked genuinely vulnerable, rather than performatively wounded. So, for 3 years, you've been sitting on $84 million while living in a rental house and driving a car that barely runs? The car runs fine, I corrected mildly. And yes, I've continued living as I always have, because that's the life I've chosen.
The trust exists to support my work and to fund community initiatives that align with my values. It's not meant to change how I live day to day. What community initiatives? Cassandra asked, and I heard her struggling to reconcile this new information with her long-standing understanding of our relative positions. The scholarship program at Meadowbrook High School that sent 15 first-generation students to college last year, the renovation of the Riverside Community Center that you drove past last month and mentioned looked surprisingly nice for that neighborhood, the expansion of the food pantry program that now serves 300 families weekly instead of 75, those initiatives, among others. Cassandra's face had gone through several shades of pale, settling finally on something resembling ash. Around us, the ballroom remained suspended in that strange collective holding of breath that happens when private drama becomes public spectacle. Preston had gone very still beside her, his businessman's mind clearly calculating the implications of what had just been revealed. "You've been funding all of that?" Cassandra asked, her voice barely audible now. "The scholarships, the community center, the food pantry?" "The trust has been funding it," I clarified. "I'm simply the steward, following Grandmother Jo's wishes that the money be used to support meaningful community work." "But that's—" Cassandra stopped, seeming to struggle with the mathematics. "That's millions of dollars in community investments. Approximately $6 million over 3 years," I confirmed, which represents less than 2% annual distribution from the trust's value. The principal continues to grow through conservative investment management.
Vivian Whitmore's expression had shifted entirely now. The polite society matron had been replaced by the sharp-eyed investor's wife, who understood exactly what kind of financial sophistication was required to manage an 8-figure trust while deploying strategic philanthropic capital. Her gaze moved between Cassandra and me with new assessment. "And you've done this while maintaining your nonprofit position?" Vivian asked, the first words she'd spoken since my approach to the head table. "Working full-time while managing a trust of that magnitude?" "I have excellent advisors," I replied. "Mr. Harrison at Harrison, Patterson & Associates handles the legal aspects. The investment management firm that Grandmother Jo used for decades continues that relationship. My role is primarily strategic, identifying community needs and determining how trust resources can create sustainable impact." "That's not a small role," Vivian observed. "That's essentially operating a private foundation while working another job. That requires considerable skill." The validation from Preston's mother seemed to unsettle Cassandra further. She'd built her identity partly on being the sophisticated one, the one who understood business and finance, while I was supposedly lost in the impractical world of social services. This reframing, that I'd been managing significant financial resources with strategic acumen all along, disrupted fundamental assumptions. "Why didn't you tell me?" Cassandra asked, and for the first time I heard something beyond defensiveness in her voice, something that might have been hurt. "We're sisters. You kept this from me for 3 years." This was the question I'd known would be the hardest to answer honestly without causing deeper wounds. But honesty, I'd learned from Grandmother Jo, was ultimately kinder than protective fiction. Because every conversation we've had about money for the last 15 years has involved you judging my choices, criticizing my career, my neighborhood, my car, my children's school. You've made it clear that you view my life as a series of failures, of missed opportunities, of settling for less than I could have achieved. "I was trying to help," Cassandra protested weakly. "Were you?" I asked, not unkindly. "Or were you reinforcing a narrative where your choices were superior and mine were deficient, where success looked like Harbor District condos and luxury cars, and anything different represented failure?" Riley had appeared at my elbow, having left table 17 to stand beside me. Owen followed moments later, flanking my other side. Their presence, solid, supportive, unflinching, reminded me why I'd made the choices I had. "You told 300 people that Mom was too broke to afford a decent dress. At your wedding, in front of everyone. You humiliated her because it made you feel superior."
Riley, I said gently, but she shook her head. No, Mom. Aunt Cassandra has been doing this for years. Every family dinner, every holiday, every time we see her. The little comments about our house, our car, our clothes, the suggestions that you wasted your potential, the implication that we're somehow less than because we don't live the way she does. Owen nodded his agreement, his 13-year-old face set with unusual seriousness. You told Grandma and Grandpa last Christmas that Mom was too broke to afford a decent dress. At your wedding, in front of everyone, you humiliated her because it made you feel superior? Riley, I said gently. But she shook her head. No, Mom. Aunt Cassandra has been doing this for years. Every family dinner, every holiday, every time we see her. The little comments about our house, our car, our clothes, the suggestions that you wasted your potential, the implication that we're somehow less than because we don't live the way she does. Owen nodded his agreement, his 13-year-old face set with unusual seriousness. You told Grandma and Grandpa last Christmas that Mom was too broke to afford a decent dress. At your wedding, in front of everyone. You humiliated her because it made you feel superior? And you told Grandma and Grandpa last Christmas that Mom could have been something if she'd made better choices. I heard you! Like helping people isn't being something. The observations from my children, witnesses to years of subtle diminishment that I'd tried to shield them from, landed with particular weight. Cassandra looked genuinely stricken now, confronted with how her comments had been received by younger family members who lacked the adult capacity for rationalization. I didn't mean, she started, but Preston's gentle hand on her arm stopped her. Maybe we should take a moment, he suggested quietly. Perhaps continue this conversation somewhere more private. But I shook my head. You made this public, Cassandra. You chose your wedding reception with all your friends and Preston's business associates present as the venue to announce my supposed financial failure. You wanted an audience for that pronouncement. So let's not pretend privacy matters now. I extracted another document from the portfolio, a simple one-page summary I'd prepared months ago, never certain if I'd need it, but wanting it available. It listed the major community initiatives funded through the trust, with brief descriptions of their impact. Meadowbrook High School First Generation Scholarship, funded $2 million. Result, 15 students currently in college who otherwise couldn't afford attendance, with 3 more graduating this year. Average family income of recipients, $32,000 annually. Cassandra stared at the document as I continued. Riverside Community Center renovation, funded $1.8 million. Result, restored gymnasium, new computer lab, expanded childcare facilities serving 80 children of working parents who previously had no affordable options. The specific numbers, the concrete outcomes, transformed abstract wealth into tangible impact. Several guests were now openly watching, no longer pretending disinterest. Emergency Housing Fund, I continued, funded $1.5 million over 3 years. Result, prevented eviction for 127 families, provided transitional housing support for 43 families escaping domestic violence, funded first-month rent assistance for 89 families transitioning from homelessness. Stop, Cassandra whispered. Please stop. But I read one more entry. Meadowbrook Public Schools Music and Arts Program Restoration, funded $800,000. Result, preserved music and art instruction that was scheduled for budget cuts, maintained access to creative education for 1,200 students, including your niece and nephew. That last detail seemed to penetrate in a way the others hadn't. Cassandra's eyes moved to Riley and Owen, understanding suddenly that the resources she'd dismissed as adequate only because they weren't elite had been enhanced by funding she'd known nothing about.
The school's orchestra program that Riley participates in, I said softly, that was cut 3 years ago. It exists now because trust funding restored it. Owen's Coding Club, the one that meets after school with donated computers and volunteer instruction, trust funded. These aren't theoretical community benefits. They're investments in your niece and nephew's education and development. You did all this, Cassandra said slowly, while letting me believe you were struggling? While letting me criticize your choices? While letting me, she gestured helplessly at the microphone still lying on the table, while letting me humiliate you publicly based on completely false assumptions? I didn't let you do anything, I corrected. You chose your actions based on your values and assumptions. I chose mine based on different values. Grandmother Joe gave me the resources to continue the work I found meaningful without financial constraint. She also gave me the wisdom to understand that proving wealth to people who measure worth by visible affluence would undermine the whole purpose. But I'm your sister, Cassandra said, and now there were tears in her eyes. Real ones, not the performative emotion she'd displayed during her wedding ceremony. You should have told me. You should have trusted me. With what? I asked gently. With information you would have used to judge my choices differently? To tell me I should be living in Harbor District? Driving a Mercedes? Sending my children to private school? To insist that wealth must be displayed to have value? The accuracy of this prediction hung between us. We both knew that's exactly how Cassandra would have reacted, how she had reacted to far smaller financial decisions over the years. Preston cleared his throat carefully. Penelope, I think what Cassandra is trying to express, perhaps not successfully, is that this revelation changes her understanding of your relationship significantly. She's been operating under false assumptions, yes, but those assumptions were partly formed by information you chose to withhold. It was a fair point, delivered diplomatically. I nodded acknowledgement. That's true, I agreed. I made a choice to honor Grandmother Joe's specific request for privacy about the trust. I also made a choice not to correct Cassandra's assumptions because doing so would have required either lying about my circumstances or revealing information I'd been asked to keep confidential. I chose the latter. You could have told me Grandmother Joe left you something significant without giving me the exact amount. You could have given me some indication that you weren't actually struggling. Could I have? I asked. Think about our last 10 conversations, Cassandra. How many of them didn't include some comment about my financial situation, my choices, my supposedly limited circumstances? You didn't want information. You wanted confirmation of a narrative where you'd succeeded and I'd failed. The bluntness of this observation seemed to rob Cassandra of her remaining defenses. She sank back into her chair, Preston's arm moving around her shoulders in automatic support. So, what happens now? She asked finally, her voice small. You've revealed all this in front of everyone at my wedding. You've proven I was completely wrong about you. Is this revenge? Punishment for being a judgmental sister? This is a boundary, I said simply. You crossed a line tonight. You used your wedding as a platform to publicly humiliate me based on assumptions you'd never bothered to verify. You did it in front of my children, your niece and nephew, demonstrating to them that my mother's work and choices deserve mockery. That required a response. The revelation hung in the crystalline air of the Grand Belmore Ballroom like the suspended moment before thunder follows lightning. I watched Cassandra process what I'd said, that this wasn't revenge, but boundary setting, and saw the distinction fail to register as meaningful. To her, they likely seemed synonymous. What she didn't know, what no one in this room except Mr. Harrison and myself knew, was how I discovered the truth about the trust in the first place. The story of that discovery, the weeks that followed, and the decision-making process that led to 3 years of deliberate silence deserved its own examination, not for vindication, but for understanding. 3 years and 2 months ago,
I'd received a phone call from Harrison, Patterson and Associates requesting my presence at their downtown offices. The timing had seemed routine. Grandmother Joe's estate had been in probate for several weeks, and various administrative details required attention. I'd assumed this meeting concerned the small bequest mentioned in the general will reading, perhaps paperwork requiring signature. Mr. Harrison's office occupied a corner suite on the 15th floor of the Merchant's Tower, with views stretching across Asherton's modest skyline toward the harbor. He'd been Grandmother Joe's attorney for over 30 years, a relationship that had begun when she needed legal guidance on her first significant real estate investment. Now in his late 60s, he possessed the particular gravitas that comes from decades of handling sensitive family matters with discretion. "Thank you for coming, Penelope," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs opposite his mahogany desk. "I realize this has been a difficult time for your family." I nodded, settling into the chair and assuming we'd proceed quickly through whatever documents required attention. Instead, Mr. Harrison had opened a locked drawer and extracted a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandmother Joe's distinctive hand. "Your grandmother left specific instructions regarding her estate, instructions that were to be shared with you privately, separate from the general will reading that your family attended."
The envelope had felt heavier than paper should. Inside was a letter, 3 pages in Grandmother Joe's precise script, and a key to a safety deposit box at Asherton First National Bank. I'd read the letter twice in Mr. Harrison's office, my hands trembling slightly as the implications became clear. Grandmother Joe had known she was dying. The cancer diagnosis she'd kept private from everyone except her medical team and Mr. Harrison. She'd used her final months to put her affairs in meticulous order, including detailed instructions about the trust she'd built over 6 decades. "You're probably wondering why you," the letter had begun, and I'd heard Grandmother Joe's voice so clearly in those words that tears blurred my vision. "Not because Cassandra is less loved, but because she doesn't need this the way you do. Your sister has always known how to navigate systems of power and wealth. She understands instinctively how to leverage social capital, how to position herself advantageously, how to pursue conventional success. These skills will serve her well in the life she's chosen." The letter had continued with observations that demonstrated how carefully Grandmother Joe had watched both her granddaughters over the years. She'd noted Cassandra's growing focus on external validation, her tendency to measure worth through visible achievement, her discomfort with ambiguity or paths that didn't lead to clearly defined success markers. "But you, my dear Penelope, chose different paths. You chose work that matters over work that pays well. You chose a neighborhood where you could build authentic community over one that would impress others. You chose integrity over image. These choices have real costs in our society: financial constraint, social judgment, the constant subtle message that you've somehow failed by not pursuing conventional success." What had struck me most powerfully was Grandmother Joe's clear-eyed understanding of both her granddaughters' strengths and limitations. She wasn't condemning Cassandra's choices or suggesting that ambition was inherently problematic. She was simply recognizing that different people needed different forms of support. "The trust exists to ensure that your choices never become financially unsustainable," the letter had explained, "so that you can continue doing work you find meaningful without the constant stress of inadequate resources, so that your children can have opportunities without you having to compromise your values, so that you can invest in your community without personal financial sacrifice preventing necessary action." Then had come the instruction that shaped the next 3 years. "I'm asking you not to tell Cassandra about this trust, not out of cruelty to her, but out of protection for you both. Your sister will judge how you use these resources. She'll have opinions about what you should do differently. She'll see this wealth as an opportunity you're wasting by not using it to elevate your lifestyle. These judgments will create conflict that serves no one." Mr. Harrison had waited patiently while I had processed the letter, then had outlined the practical details.
The trust's current value, the investment strategy, my discretionary authority, the recommended annual distribution rate, the legal protections ensuring privacy, the ongoing administrative support his firm would provide. This is an enormous responsibility, I had said finally, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Your grandmother believed you were equal to it, Mr. Harrison had replied, and having known you since you were a child accompanying Jo to our meetings about her property investments, I concur with her assessment. The safety deposit box had contained additional documents, detailed records of every investment Grandmother Jo had made over 60 years, notes about her decision-making process, even copies of the books on investing and financial strategy she'd studied. It was a masterclass in patient wealth building, left for me to understand not just what she'd created, but how and why. The weeks following that revelation had been disorienting. I'd continued my work at Riverside Community Services, continued living in our rental house, continued the rhythms of daily life while processing the reality that everything had fundamentally changed. Or rather, that nothing had changed except my awareness of resources available to support the life I was already living. The temptation to tell someone, anyone, had been powerful. The weight of the secret felt substantial, particularly during moments when Cassandra made her casual comments about my limited circumstances. But Grandmother Jo's reasoning had been sound. Every scenario I'd imagined for telling Cassandra ended with conflict, with judgment, with her insistence that I was wasting an opportunity by not using wealth to achieve visible success. So I kept the secret, as requested. I'd established relationships with the investment advisors Grandmother Jo had used. I studied her notes and strategies, learning to think about wealth not as consumption, but as a tool for creating sustainable impact. I'd identified community needs where strategic investment could create long-term change rather than just providing temporary relief. The first major initiative was the scholarship program. Meadowbrook High School served a predominantly working-class community, with 70% of students qualifying for free or reduced lunch. College attendance rates were low, not because students lacked ability, but because they lacked resources and support systems to navigate applications, financial aid, and the intimidating transition to higher education. I had approached the school's guidance counselor, Dr. Patricia Fernandez, with a proposal: anonymous funding for a comprehensive program supporting first-generation college students. Not just tuition money, but also support for test prep, application fees, summer bridge programs, ongoing mentorship. The total commitment was substantial, $2 million over 5 years, but designed to create systemic change rather than just individual assistance. "Who's funding this?" Dr. Fernandez asked, understandably suspicious of too-good-to-be-true offers.
"A private foundation," I'd replied, which was technically accurate. "The donor prefers anonymity but has a long-standing commitment to educational equity." The program's success had exceeded even optimistic projections. 15 students from that first cohort were now thriving at various colleges, maintaining strong GPAs and staying connected through the mentorship program. 3 more were preparing to graduate this spring with full rides to universities that had previously seemed impossibly out of reach. Similar patterns had emerged with the community center renovation, the emergency housing fund, the food pantry expansion. Strategic investment in community infrastructure created ripple effects that extended far beyond the initial funding. A renovated gymnasium meant space for youth basketball leagues that kept teenagers engaged in positive activities. A computer lab meant job training programs for adults seeking better employment. Expanded childcare meant working parents could maintain employment without impossible logistics. None of this had happened quickly or easily. Each initiative required research, relationship building, careful planning, and ongoing oversight. I'd learned to balance my full-time nonprofit work with trust management by treating the latter as a strategic part-time role, dedicating evenings and weekends to the careful stewardship Grandmother Jo had entrusted to me. The ballroom remained unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that develops when hundreds of people are collectively eavesdropping while pretending not to. Cassandra sat frozen at the head table, her wedding makeup beginning to streak slightly as tears threatened to fully materialize. Preston maintained his protective posture beside her, though I noticed his expression had shifted from supportive husband to someone recalculating a significant equation. I returned the documents to the leather portfolio, feeling the weight of 300 gazes upon me. Riley and Owen stood close, their presence a reminder that whatever happened in this moment would become part of our family story, shaping how they understood conflict resolution, boundary setting, and the complicated dynamics of family loyalty. I need to understand something, Cassandra said, finally, her voice stripped of its earlier confidence. When did you decide to bring those documents tonight? Did you plan this? Were you waiting for me to say something you could use against me? The question revealed how she was processing this, as a strategic maneuver rather than a boundary response. It was so characteristic of how Cassandra approached relationships, always looking for the tactical angle, the power play, the calculated move. I brought them 3 weeks ago, I said quietly, when you sent me the seating chart placing my children and me at table 17 behind a floral arrangement near the service entrance. When you texted me suggesting I might want to borrow something appropriate to wear because you knew my closet probably didn't contain anything suitable for your venue. When you made those comments to Mom about hoping I wouldn't embarrass you by showing up looking too nonprofit casual. Each example landed visibly. Our mother, Christine, was seated at table 8 with our father, and I saw her face register recognition of conversations I'd apparently not been the only one to receive. I brought them not planning to use them, I continued. I brought them as a reminder to myself that your judgment didn't define my worth, that your narrative about my life wasn't accurate, that I had nothing to prove. But I also brought them because some part of me recognized that you'd been building towards something like this for years, and I wanted to be prepared if you finally crossed a line that required a response. So this is my fault, Cassandra asked, anger flickering beneath her distress. I'm the villain in this story. This isn't about villains and heroes, I replied, exhausted suddenly by the drama, by the public spectacle, by the years of accumulated tension finally erupting in this ornate ballroom. Vivian Whitmore spoke again, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to managing difficult social situations. Perhaps this conversation has reached the point where privacy would serve everyone better. The wedding reception can continue. Family matters can be discussed more appropriately elsewhere. It was both suggestion and directive, delivered with the subtle command of someone who'd spent decades managing her own family's complex dynamics within Asherton's social hierarchy. She was right, of course. Whatever needed to happen next didn't require an audience of 300 witnesses. But Cassandra shook her head. No, if we're doing this, we're finishing it here. Penny made this public. We're not pretending it didn't happen. There was something almost admirable in her refusal to retreat, even in defeat. Cassandra had never been someone who hid from consequences, even self-created ones. It was one of her better qualities, actually, the willingness to face uncomfortable situations rather than avoiding them. Fine, I agreed. Then let me say this clearly for everyone to hear so there's no ambiguity about what happened here tonight. Cassandra, you chose to use your wedding reception as a platform to publicly humiliate me based on assumptions about my financial circumstances. You did this in front of your friends, Preston's business associates, our extended family, and most importantly, in front of my children, your niece and nephew. Riley's hand found mine, squeezing gently. Owen had moved slightly closer, his protective instinct toward his mother overriding his typical teenage self-consciousness about public displays of emotion.
You made those assumptions, I continued, without ever asking me directly about my circumstances, without considering that I might have reasons for my choices beyond limitation, without recognizing that different people define success and fulfillment differently. You measured my life against your values and found it wanting, then announced that judgment publicly. I thought you were struggling, Cassandra protested weakly. I thought you were too proud to accept help. I was trying to— You weren't trying to help, I interrupted, and my voice carried enough force that she stopped mid-sentence. If you'd wanted to help, you would have had a private conversation. You would have asked questions. You would have offered support without public pronouncement. What you did tonight was performance, demonstrating to everyone here that you'd succeeded while I'd failed, that your choices were superior while mine were pitiable. The accuracy of this assessment was reflected in Cassandra's inability to mount a defense. Around us, I sensed subtle shifts in the crowd's sympathy. What might initially have seemed like family drama was crystallizing into something more specific, a pattern of behavior many had likely witnessed before being named explicitly. "The trust fund doesn't make me better than you," I said, softening my tone slightly. "The community work I've funded doesn't make my choices superior to yours. You've built a successful career, married someone you love, created a life that brings you satisfaction. Those are genuine achievements. But Cassandra, you've spent years using my different choices as a foil to highlight your success. You've made my life a cautionary tale in your narrative about making the right decisions." Preston's expression suggested this observation wasn't entirely news to him. I wondered how many times Cassandra had made similar comparisons in their private conversations, using her sister's supposedly limited circumstances as contrast to her own achievements. "Tonight," I concluded, "you took that pattern to its logical extreme, and I responded by establishing a boundary. Not to humiliate you, though I understand that's how it feels, but to make clear that I won't accept public diminishment based on false assumptions and different values." The silence that followed felt different from the shocked quiet that had preceded it. This was processing silence, the collective consideration of competing narratives and uncomfortable truths. My father stood from table 8, his architect's bearing evident even at 68. He approached the head table with deliberate steps, and when he arrived, he did something that surprised me. He placed a hand on Cassandra's shoulder, then turned to address the room. "I think," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had always commanded attention without demanding it, "that my daughters have given all of us something to think about regarding how we measure worth and success. And I think the rest of this conversation should happen privately, within our family, where it belongs. This is still Cassandra and Preston's wedding day. Whatever needs to be resolved between sisters can be addressed tomorrow, next week, in whatever time it requires, but not here, not now, not like this." It was gracefully done, acknowledging the gravity of what had occurred while creating space for de-escalation. My father had always possessed this gift for finding the middle path between competing necessities. Cassandra looked up at him, tears now falling freely. "Daddy, I didn't mean, I thought—" "I know," he said gently. "We'll talk about what you thought and what happened, but not here. Let Preston's parents salvage what they can of this reception. Let your guests return to celebrating your marriage. Let everyone take a breath." He turned to me then, his expression complex. "Penny, you made your point. Effectively. Perhaps more publicly than necessary, but I understand why you felt it needed to be made. Now, let's allow this evening to proceed as planned, or as close to planned as possible." My father's intervention created the permission structure everyone needed to step back from the precipice. The band, reading the room with professional acuity, began playing again, something soft and instrumental that filled the silence without demanding attention. Waiters materialized with remarkable timing, offering champagne refills and clearing abandoned dessert plates, their choreographed movement giving guests something to focus on besides the family drama at the head table. Riley and Owen returned to table 17 with me, though we didn't sit immediately. The three of us stood in our corner, a small island of processing, while the reception attempted to reconstitute itself around us. "Mom, are you okay?" Riley asked quietly, her maturity in that moment transcending her 16 years. "I'm not sure yet," I answered honestly. "That was harder than I expected it to be." Owen, typically more reserved with emotional observations, said something that cut to the heart of it. "Aunt Cassandra needed to hear it, though. She's been mean to you for years."
Not mean, exactly, I corrected gently, though her characterization wasn't entirely wrong. Dismissive, judgmental, operating from assumptions she never questioned. That's a fancy way of saying mean, Owen replied with the brutal clarity of 13-year-old logic. Around us, the reception was slowly regaining momentum. Guests who'd been frozen in shocked attention began resuming conversations, though I noticed many glances still directed our way. The photographer had retreated to capturing safe moments, toasts being raised, couples on the dance floor, the elaborate floral centerpieces. Studiously avoiding the head table where Cassandra sat with Preston, both sets of parents now clustered around them in what appeared to be intense, quiet discussion. My mother appeared at our table, her face drawn with the particular exhaustion that comes from watching your children wound each other. Christine had always tried to maintain neutrality between Cassandra and me, supporting both daughters' different choices without choosing sides. Tonight had shattered that careful balance.
"Penny," she said, pulling me into a tight hug. "I should have said something years ago. I should have stopped her pattern of comments about your life. I told myself it was just sisterly dynamics, that you were both adults who didn't need their mother intervening. I was wrong." The acknowledgement surprised me. "Mom, you couldn't have changed how Cassandra views success and worth. Those beliefs are core to her identity." "Maybe not," she agreed, releasing me from the embrace but keeping one hand on my arm. "But I could have made clear that I didn't share those views. I could have actively validated your choices instead of remaining passive. My silence was read as agreement with Cassandra's assessments." Riley had been listening to this exchange, and now she spoke up. "Grandma, you told me last month that you were proud of how Mom made do with limited resources. That's kind of the same thing Aunt Cassandra says, just nicer." My mother's face registered the accuracy of Riley's observation. Even well-meaning family members had internalized the narrative of my financial limitation, had praised my ability to make the most of supposedly constrained circumstances, the benevolent version of the same fundamental assumption. "You're right," my mother said to Riley, then turned back to me. "I've participated in the same pattern Cassandra took to its extreme tonight. I'm sorry, Penny, truly." Before I could respond, Mr. Harrison appeared at our table. His presence at the wedding made sense now, as Grandmother Joe's longtime attorney would naturally be included in significant family events. But his specific approach to me at this moment suggested purpose beyond social courtesy. "Penelope," he said quietly, "might I have a word, privately?" We moved to a quieter corner near the hotel's expansive windows overlooking the harbor. The sun was setting, casting the water in shades of amber and rose that would have been romantic under different circumstances. I received several phone calls this evening from people at this reception who apparently have my contact information through various professional connections. They're asking about the trust, about whether you're accepting proposals for community investments, about the process for requesting funding consideration. The implications settled over me with uncomfortable weight. What had been private family conflict was now public knowledge of my role as steward of significant philanthropic resources. The careful anonymity I'd maintained for 3 years had evaporated in a single confrontation. That was inevitable the moment you revealed the trust's existence. I'm not suggesting you made the wrong choice in responding to your sister, but the consequences extend beyond family dynamics. You'll need to develop a formal process for handling funding requests, establish clear criteria, probably create some kind of formal foundation structure for legal protection. "I understand," I said, though the full scope of what had shifted was still crystallizing. "How quickly does this need to happen?" Given that several people at this reception represent major nonprofits and community organizations in Asherton, I'd suggest you have preliminary structures in place within 30 days. Otherwise, you'll be managing an overwhelming volume of informal requests without clear processes. He was right, of course.
The careful, quiet stewardship I'd practiced for 3 years, identifying needs through my own observation and relationships, funding initiatives strategically and anonymously, was no longer possible. The trust's existence was now public knowledge, and with that knowledge came expectations, requests, and pressures I'd successfully avoided until tonight. "I'll call your office Monday morning to begin that process," I said, feeling simultaneously exhausted and strangely liberated. The secret-keeping carried its own burden, one I'd been managing without fully acknowledging its weight. Mr. Harrison nodded, then surprised me by adding, "For what it's worth, I think Josephine would have approved of how you handled tonight. She valued direct honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, especially when it was uncomfortable." After he departed, I remained by the windows for several minutes, watching the harbor's shifting colors and trying to process everything that had unfolded. The confrontation with Cassandra, yes, but also the larger implications of visibility, of moving from private stewardship to public foundation management, of fundamentally changing how I engaged with the community work that had defined my adult life. Riley found me there, slipping her hand into my own without speaking immediately. We stood together watching the sunset until she said, "Everything's gonna be different now, isn't it?" "Yes," I acknowledged, though I'm not entirely sure how yet. "Are you glad you told everyone? Or do you wish you'd just let Aunt Cassandra say her thing and stayed quiet?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since placing those documents on the head table. "I'm glad I established a boundary," I said carefully. "I'm not sure yet about the method or the consequences. Ask me again in 6 months when I've had time to process everything." The reception continued around us with determined normalcy. The cake was cut with appropriate ceremony. Preston and Cassandra shared their first dance as husband and wife, though her smile looked strained and his expression suggested he was still recalculating what this marriage to my sister actually meant. Guests danced, drank, celebrated the union while undoubtedly discussing the family drama in whispered asides. 6 months had passed since Cassandra's wedding, and the transformation of my carefully private life into something unavoidably public had reshaped nearly everything. The Fitzgerald Community Foundation, named after our family surname rather than any individual, at my father's suggestion, now occupied a small suite of offices in the renovated Merchants Building downtown. What had been solitary evening work managing the trust had evolved into a structured operation with 3 part-time staff members, formal grant application processes, and quarterly community advisory meetings.
I'd reduced my hours at Riverside Community Services to half-time, a decision that had felt like betrayal initially, but proved necessary once funding requests began arriving at a rate of 15 to 20 per week. The foundation received proposals ranging from thoughtful, well-researched initiatives addressing genuine community needs to barely coherent pitches from individuals who'd heard I had money and wanted some of it. Developing criteria to evaluate these requests fairly while maintaining the strategic focus Grandmother Jo had valued required more time and structure than I'd anticipated. The children had adjusted to our changed circumstances with the resilience and adaptability that continually surprised me. Riley had initially worried that knowledge of the trust would change how her friends viewed her, but the foundation's public framing, as a community resource rather than personal wealth, had largely insulated her from the social complications she'd feared. Owen had become unexpectedly interested in the foundation's operations, attending several advisory meetings and offering observations about program evaluation that demonstrated his analytical mind. The most significant change, however, involved the person I'd least expected to re-engage with meaningfully, Cassandra. The week after her wedding, she'd sent a brief text. "Can we talk? Really talk, not perform for an audience." We'd met at a quiet coffee shop in the University District, neutral territory that belonged to neither of our usual contexts. That conversation had been painful, productive, and marked the beginning of something that resembled actual sisterhood rather than competitive posturing.
I've been in therapy, Cassandra had said during that first meeting, her hands wrapped around an untouched latte. Intensive therapy. Preston insisted on it as a condition of continuing our marriage after what happened at the reception. The revelation had surprised me. Preston had struck me as conflict-averse, someone who'd smooth over difficulties rather than demanding accountability. Apparently, I'd misjudged him. What he actually said, Cassandra continued, was that he didn't recognize the person who'd humiliated her sister publicly at their wedding reception, that the woman he dated and proposed to had shown judgmental tendencies, yes, but nothing approaching that level of cruelty. He said if that was who I actually was, he needed to know before we built a life together. She'd looked genuinely shaken recounting this ultimatum. So I found Dr. Patricia Whitmore, no relation to Preston's family, weird coincidence, and I've been seeing her twice a week for the past 6 months. The work Cassandra had been doing in therapy revealed itself gradually over subsequent meetings. She'd begun examining the belief systems that had structured her entire adult life, that worth was demonstrated through visible achievement, that success meant outpacing peers in measurable ways, that different choices represented hierarchy rather than diversity. These weren't easy beliefs to interrogate. They'd been reinforced by countless cultural messages and had shaped everything from her career decisions to her choice of husband. Dr. Whitmore asked me where I learned that love was conditional on achievement, Cassandra had shared during one of our monthly coffee meetings, which had become a tentative ritual. I immediately thought about Mom and Dad, but that wasn't fair to them. They never actually said that, but somehow I internalized it anyway, that approval required exceptional performance, that being ordinary was shameful, that my value came from what I accomplished rather than who I was. Watching my sister engage this difficult internal work had been unexpectedly moving. The Cassandra who'd stood at her wedding reception announcing my supposed poverty with such conviction had been operating from deep insecurity, masked as superiority. The woman slowly emerging through therapeutic examination was more vulnerable, but also more genuine. Our parents had navigated this evolution with their own complexity. My mother had taken Cassandra's public behavior as a referendum on her parenting, wondering what she'd done wrong to create such competitive dynamics between her daughters. My father had been characteristically pragmatic, suggesting that family systems were complicated and that blame was less useful than understanding. The Foundation's first major initiative after formalizing had been deliberately chosen to honor both grandmother Jo's values and the new reality of public operations. The Asherton Affordable Housing Development Project committed $12 million over 5 years to create mixed-income housing in 3 neighborhoods, including Meadowbrook. Rather than displacement-based gentrification, the project aimed to preserve existing community while improving housing quality and creating pathways to home ownership for working-class families. The project's scale and ambition had attracted significant attention. Local media covered the announcement extensively, the mayor attended the groundbreaking ceremony, various nonprofit organizations and community groups wanted to partner on different aspects of the work. What had been quiet strategic funding had become unavoidably visible civic engagement. This visibility brought its own challenges. I received regular invitations to serve on nonprofit boards, to attend fundraising galas, to speak at conferences about philanthropic strategy. Each invitation required decisions about how to allocate limited time and attention, how to remain focused on meaningful work, rather than becoming consumed by the performance of philanthropy that I'd always found distasteful. Preston, interestingly, had become an unexpected ally in navigating these waters. His family's banking connections meant he'd observed philanthropic dynamics for decades, and he possessed useful cynicism about which engagements were substantive versus performative. We'd begun having occasional lunches where he'd offer perspective on various proposals and invitations, helping me distinguish genuine collaboration opportunities from social climbing disguised as partnership. The Asherton Arts Council invitation is legitimate. They do real work with sustainable funding models. But the Harborfront Preservation Society is basically a social club for wealthy people who want tax deductions for attending parties. You can safely decline that one.
These conversations had created unexpected bridge building between Preston and me, which in turn had helped Cassandra feel less isolated in her marriage. She'd apparently worried that her husband and sister couldn't coexist comfortably after the wedding debacle, that family gatherings would be perpetually tense. Instead, a more complex but ultimately healthier dynamic was developing. The Foundation's Community Advisory Board had become one of my favorite aspects of the formalized structure. Rather than making unilateral funding decisions, I'd assembled a diverse group of 15 community members: teachers, social workers, small business owners, clergy, formerly incarcerated individuals working in reentry programs, immigrants navigating integration challenges, who brought lived expertise to evaluating proposals and identifying genuine needs. The morning I received the call from Detective Sarah Brennan of the Asherton Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, I was reviewing applications for the Foundation's new Youth Entrepreneurship Program. Her request for an immediate meeting, delivered with professional courtesy but unmistakable urgency, disrupted what had been an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. "This concerns your sister, Cassandra Whitmore," Detective Brennan explained when I arrived at her downtown office an hour later, "and potentially the trust fund you manage." The words triggered immediate alarm. 6 months of careful relationship rebuilding with Cassandra, the fragile progress we'd made, the therapy she'd committed to, all of it suddenly felt precarious. Detective Brennan slid a folder across her desk. 3 weeks ago, we received a complaint from Meridian Investment Group alleging fraudulent activity involving forged documents related to the Josephine Fitzgerald Trust. The documents in question were used to secure a personal loan of $2.3 million, with the trust listed as collateral. My stomach dropped. That's impossible. I'm the sole trustee. I haven't authorized any loans or used the trust as collateral for anything. "We're aware," Detective Brennan said, "which is why we're investigating this as potential fraud. The documents bear your signature, but our forensics team believes they're sophisticated forgeries. The loan was approved 6 weeks ago by a junior loan officer at Asherton Community Bank, a bank where your brother-in-law Preston Whitmore's family has significant influence." The implications were staggering. I opened the folder, scanning the documents with growing disbelief. They were indeed convincing forgeries. My signature replicated with remarkable accuracy on trust authorization forms that never existed, financial statements that matched the trust's actual value, but bore dates I'd never signed anything. "Who took out this loan?" I asked, though some terrible instinct was already forming the answer. The loan was issued to CW Consulting LLC, a limited liability company registered 8 weeks ago. The company's sole owner and operator is Cassandra Whitmore. The betrayal landed like physical impact. After months of reconciliation, of watching Cassandra engage difficult therapeutic work, of believing we'd moved past the competitive dynamics that had poisoned our relationship, she'd been planning fraud against the trust that had funded community work that represented Grandmother Joe's life's work while simultaneously attending our monthly coffee meetings and talking about growth and healing. "I need you to understand something," Detective Brennan continued carefully. "We haven't arrested your sister yet. We're still building the case, confirming the forgeries, establishing intent. But given the sophistication of these documents and the family connection to the approving bank, this appears to be premeditated fraud rather than impulsive opportunity crime." "What was the money for?" I asked, my voice sounding distant. Detective Brennan consulted her notes.
The loan application stated it was for business expansion. CW Consulting apparently provides strategic advisory services to mid-sized companies, but our preliminary investigation suggests the company has no actual clients, no ongoing projects, no legitimate business operations. The $2.3 million was transferred to the company account and then dispersed to various personal accounts within 72 hours. I sat in Detective Brennan's office processing layers of betrayal. The forgery itself, the exploitation of family relationship for criminal purpose, the calculated nature of establishing a shell company weeks before executing the fraud. Most devastating, the performance of reconciliation while planning this theft. I need to contact my attorney, I said finally, and I need to inform the trust's legal advisors at Harrison, Patterson, and Associates. Of course, Detective Brennan agreed. But Miss Fitzgerald, I need to ask, did you have any indication your sister was facing financial difficulties? Any reason she might have felt desperate enough to attempt something like this? The question prompted uncomfortable reflection. Cassandra and Preston's lifestyle had always appeared comfortable. The Harbor District condo, the luxury vehicles, the elaborate wedding that had precipitated our public confrontation. But appearances could be deceiving, particularly for someone whose self-worth was tied to visible affluence. I don't know, I admitted. We had been rebuilding our relationship over the past 6 months, but those conversations focused on emotional patterns and family dynamics. We didn't discuss her finances. What Detective Brennan couldn't have known, what I was only now recognizing, was that Cassandra's discovery of the trust 6 months ago hadn't eliminated her competitive instincts. It had merely redirected them. If I had $84 million in trust assets, perhaps she reasoned that she deserved comparable resources. If Grandmother Jo had excluded her from the inheritance, perhaps she decided to take what she believed should have been hers all along. The subsequent investigation unfolded over 3 weeks of increasing complexity. Preston, when questioned, claimed complete ignorance of Cassandra's loan or the forged documents. The junior loan officer who had approved the fraudulent application had indeed been pressured to expedite the process, but insisted he'd believed the documents were legitimate, that the Whitmore family connection had created inappropriate trust rather than intentional collusion.
Cassandra herself, when finally confronted by police, had initially attempted denial before the evidence became overwhelming. Then she'd shifted to justification, claiming the trust should have been divided between both granddaughters, that Grandmother Jo's exclusion of her had been unfair, that taking a portion of assets she'd been wrongfully denied wasn't really theft. Our parents were devastated. My father, typically measured and rational, spent an entire afternoon in his study after learning about Cassandra's arrest, emerging with red eyes and no appetite for dinner. My mother alternated between defending Cassandra's actions as products of mental health crisis and expressing fury at the betrayal of family trust. Riley and Owen processed the situation with the directness of teenage perspective. Aunt Cassandra tried to steal from the foundation? Owen had asked when I'd explained the situation. From the programs helping people? She tried to steal from the trust, I'd corrected carefully, which funds those programs, yes. That's worse than what she did at the wedding, Riley observed. That was mean and embarrassing. This is actual crime that hurts people. Their moral clarity, unencumbered by adult complexity and familial loyalty, cut through my own conflicted feelings. Yes, Cassandra was my sister. Yes, I understood the psychological wounds that had contributed to her choices. But she'd attempted to steal millions of dollars from resources meant to serve community needs, using forgery and family relationship as criminal tools. The legal proceedings were complicated by Preston's decision to file for divorce 2 weeks after Cassandra's arrest. His attorney made clear that Preston would cooperate fully with the investigation and that Cassandra's criminal activities had occurred without his knowledge or consent. The Whitmore family, protecting their banking reputation, publicly distanced themselves from Cassandra's actions while quietly funding a defense attorney to minimize public scandal. I faced my own difficult decision regarding prosecution.
The district attorney's office offered me significant input given my position as the defrauded party. I could push for maximum penalties, potentially 5 to 7 years in prison for fraud of this magnitude, or I could advocate for reduced charges, contingent on restitution and treatment. The choice felt impossible. The community work funded by the trust served hundreds of families. Cassandra's attempted theft, had it succeeded, would have disrupted ongoing programs and broken trust with partner organizations. From this perspective, strong consequences seemed necessary both for justice and deterrence. But she was still my sister. Still the person I'd spent 6 months carefully rebuilding relationship with. Still someone whose psychological wounds I understood, even while refusing to excuse the criminal behavior they generated. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.